Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. This morning's briefing is going to be a bit of a gut check for the Tethers who've been spending some time telling us about how there have been black politicians in America who have been getting arrested and how they're just not doing enough for foundational black Americans. True, but the question becomes, why is it that the Tethers don't seem to be concerned about home? They want to be angry at us because we've decided to delineate ourselves, and they say that this whole delineation thing is just wrong. But if that's the case, tell me this. Why is it that the Tethers are the first ones to be waving the flag for a country that they, or at least their parents, couldn't wait to flee from? And whenever you point out to this that this is their home and that they need to be standing up for it, the first thing that they tell you is, well, I'm not there anymore, and those guys over there, that's their problem. So in other words, they want to delineate too when it suits them. But for the Tethers who seem to be thinking to themselves that it's some sort of flex for them to be saying that Donald Trump's going to be cutting this or that social program and saying, you niggas are going to be starving, etc., etc. White media reports are that Trump is specifically making sure to cut U.S. aid that's aimed at African countries in specific, and that's not a surprise. Elon Musk has had an axe to grind against the Africans for the longest time, but they should have been preparing for this. They've had decades. Instead, they've been sitting back telling themselves that they're self-sufficient. What we're seeing is the price of tribalism. Tribalism is a luxury that black people anywhere in the world simply cannot afford, and yet we've had people trying to indulge that delusion for decades now. People said they were better than us. They tried to play the pathetic game of respectability politics with white supremacy, and they thought they would get a leg up at our expense. And we've been warning them for decades and warned them, and truth be told, we should have cut them loose decades ago the moment it became obvious that they weren't with us. Any black person on this planet after the year 1492 who needs to be told that white supremacy is the enemy and who thinks they can stab us in the back to benefit themselves, that's someone who is a traitor to you and me. What the Africans refuse to accept, and I'm talking about the quote-unquote radical ones in this case, is that these white supremacists are not impressed by you occasionally shaking your fists at them. 4 going on 5 generations after so-called independence, and so far it's been puppet leaders chosen and set up by their former colonial masters who talk tough for the cameras, but who don't actually do anything. Shaking one's fist means nothing when you're dealing with the most violent and well-armed forces on the planet. Swinging that fist, on the other hand, well, that seems to be the kind of effort that the African simply is not willing to put out. They must come to understand that they have caused much of their own problems. They have deliberately rejected all attempts by people who were operating in their interest to help them. They have been hostile and antagonistic towards foundational black Americans, and it would be one thing if they were building on their own. But they haven't been doing that. They've been waiting to see if foreigners will do it for them. They clearly prefer seeing non-black foreigners come in, take the land, whip them like slaves, and make off with their resources and establish themselves as a new ruling class over the Africans. So I'm not hoping that Niger's current posture changes, but as I've said before when I spoke on this last year, there have been a number of African leaders who have already rattled their sabers at the Europeans before, and they've all come to nothing. They're surrounded by vipers in their midst. That's what's the real problem. They would be far better off if they had merely looked to the U.S., where there's already a large pool of skilled and eager black people who built things here and would have been genuinely willing to help them there. But that's where the old tribalism comes in. That's the problem. You got people who are thinking to themselves that their own little 6-foot circle of relatives and in-laws is apparently the greatest thing on earth, and that's somebody who's psychologically masturbating is what that is. In order for the Africans to admit to the mistake they've made, it would require a sacrifice of ego and pride that they're not prepared to make. It seems they consider it to be more dignified to be whipped by the Asians and slapped around by the Europeans. Am I saying that they absolutely cannot get the job done without us? Well, what I'm saying is that for 4 generations now, they haven't gotten the job done at all. That's a fact. And what we're witnessing today is the final verdict on all of that tribalism. There's a mass exodus of Africans out of Africa. I'm also saying that had they merely allied themselves with us, they would have already had things popping over there. That's a fact, too. With a significant foundational black American presence there and the kind of unapologetic blackness that we represent, these neo-colonialists coming from South Korea and China and elsewhere, they would definitely not be able to get a toehold in Africa. Instead, the Africans try to make themselves feel better about lying down for new colonial masters by claiming they've got everything under complete control, they got the situation handled, and nobody's taking them over. Meanwhile, they're still living in shanties, and instead of being the most comfortable people in their own countries, they're living in squalor. Meanwhile, you got foreigners who are just coming in the front door and the Africans are fleeing out every other exit. 2/3 of them are trying to storm across the Mediterranean and the rest are trying to come into the U.S. through South America. That is not success. The reason that Elon Musk and his pals feel like they can disrespect Africa with impunity is because they can. White supremacists don't care about words. They're the masters of empty talk. What they care about is what you're going to do. When they disrespect you, they're testing you to see what your reaction will be. If your reaction is merely a response, that is words, then they'll increase the disrespect until it inevitably becomes open violence. The only thing the white supremacist understands is action, not words. The Africans have not forced any of these white supremacists over there to pay them reparations. That's the first thing that should have happened. As the so-called governments in these countries, they should be charging all these European nations that dominated them and their expats who live in these African countries reparations, telling them all, you got to pay up, and tell them it will take them hundreds of years to pay off the greatest debt in human history. You see, that's what France did to Haiti. They forced reparations for the people they have victimized. Instead, what we're seeing in Africa is absurdity of absurdities. You have African nations in debt to the very Europeans and the U.S. in the form of so-called international loans. Were it not for Africa, the Europeans wouldn't have any money to loan to anyone anywhere. They're literally letting these white supremacists bribe them with their own money. And it's not just the IMF. Perhaps you've heard about Prospera. Long story short, it seems that some of Elon Musk's tech bro pals read Atlas Shrugged a few too many times because now they're doing what they call startup cities. What they're trying to do is they're actually trying to live out a real-life version of their libertarian wet dreams. Basically, it's billionaires going to third world countries and asking them for a piece of land to set up unregulated businesses and ventures, basically their own private countries inside a country. Now, they claim that it's all about sparking development in these poor nations. Get these guys making businesses without all the red tape and bringing in foreigners who would be free to do whatever kind of experiments or whatever kind of ventures that they want without all of the unnecessary paperwork and oversight of their own home countries. That's what they say, but in reality, it's private interests setting up what amounts to their own corporate colonies. The dream that they sell to these third world countries is that they're going to establish futuristic techno-cities in these dirt-poor nations. But when you look, you only see white people who are enjoying whatever opportunities there allegedly are, and the non-white locals, they're working mostly as cleaners. But the Prospera proponents like to say, we pay better than they would get from the employers outside of our private compound. You know, that sounds just like every white corporation that's ever set up a plantation or a factory in these countries. And, as has already been seen in Honduras, they got the government down there to authorize a law legalizing so-called special economic zones. These are territories within the country that allow these wealthy foreigners to come in and establish what are privately owned self-governing cities that are tax-exempt and not under the laws of Honduras. Prospera started off in Honduras, on an island no less. And at the time, it seemed to be acceptable because, hey, you got some rich white guys who are sitting here trying to daydream some sort of libertarian paradise on an island, so they're not going to really be big problems for the locals. But something that not too many people noticed at the time that the ZEDI laws were being pushed through the Honduran government by the tech bros is that part of the ZEDI law allows for companies like Prospera to partner with the government to expropriate the locals' land. So, instead of having the government of Honduras taking land, Prospera can simply say, go ahead and take that land for us and give it to us. And they can get it done. The people behind Prospera keep talking about how they want to make Honduras basically the Singapore of Latin America. The problem is that would be impossible with a small, tiny island like Roatan. In order to try to have anything even comparable to Singapore, you would need a heck of a lot more real estate. Like, say, the entire country of Honduras. And that's what's got the locals worried. When these tech bros give their grandiose plans about how they're going to build a brand new world, everybody knows you can't do that from a couple of rocks out in the Pacific. You're going to need land and a lot of it, if for nothing else than to control the resources that are on that land, because you can't build an economy without resources. I remember reading one time about this Native American chieftain who said that when the white people first showed up in America, they first claimed that they only wanted a small piece of land. Enough for a house, they said. But of course they didn't build houses. They built military forts. And from there they began carrying out military attacks. I myself have explained that when it comes to these white supremacists, they have a pattern that they follow. First, they send in their missionaries, who claim all they want is to spread the gospel and meet the locals. Then their merchants show up afterwards because, hey, the missionaries need a taste of home. And after all, these businessmen want to trade with the locals. Nothing harmful here, right? Then they send in their military, because once they have an economic beachhead and they got a number of these missionaries from home there, well, now they have economic interest and their own expatriates that they have to defend. But if all else fails, they'll simply lie and claim that some of their people were attacked, so they have no choice but to invade and take over everything, as they did in Africa. Or they'll lie and claim that there's some evil, brutal regime in power who's oppressing the local people, so they have to go in there and free these poor downtrodden people for the sake of democracy, of course. Now, there's no democracy in the United States. Black people haven't enjoyed democracy for a single instant. And it's because of these exact same people who keep claiming that they're so devoted to bringing democracy to all these other countries. When the Romans invaded, they told the Europeans that they were bringing civilization, culture, and technical achievements and advancements, and of course protection from, well, anyone else who might be looking to colonize these people first. So basically the racket was, we have to colonize you before somebody else does. When the Europeans went on their genocidal global rampage, they copied the Roman playbook lie by lie. They were doing it for the benefit of all these savages out there. After all, they must, because it's the white man's burden. And today, we hear the same thing from these corporate tech bros. They need to own land in these third world countries because there's simply no other way to benefit the locals. Never mind the fact that if tech bros like Elon Musk weren't running around encouraging coups and politically destabilizing these third world countries, they would be far more stable and prosperous already. Oh, and by the way, like every other white supremacist scheme, these clowns claim that it's all about freedom and people being able to live life on their own terms. Well, the people of Honduras are now choosing to get Prospera and their wealthy white oligarchs out of their country. They repealed the law that allowed for those special economic zones to be set up, and now the freedom-loving white oligarchs who were so friendly before now, they're suing Honduras for billions of dollars, which is many times more than that country produces. So much for loving freedom, huh? So much for it being all about personal choice by the locals. So much for being there to benefit the native population, right? The times change, but these people don't. Now you might be saying, well, that's unfortunate for those Latinos down there, but you know, they've always cozied up to these white supremacists, so this is what happens. Yeah, but these white supremacists always have a plan B, and that plan B is Prospera Africa. They've already been working overtime to get their hooks into Namibia, and they've been eyeing plenty of other real estate throughout the continent. They're talking about they want to build up Africa through free markets, and of course, they happen to have a black person who's the face of it, and they're even tapping into the whole black feminist shtick, making sure that they're pointing out, we want to have as many women business owners in Africa as possible. I mean, they're just pressing every cheap button that they can. But it's interesting because free markets are exactly what brought about slavery on the continent, and colonialism, and the economic rape of these places that came afterwards. Massive exploitation as a driver of wealth for the white rulers who intend to take up shop there, and this time they're not going to be coming from Europe. They plan to come from the United States.
How old were you when you made your first million?
Well, how old was I when I made my first $1 million? Oh my goodness, I don't know, 28.
What line of business are you in?
What line of business am I in now?
Yeah.
I'm an investor.
So you're in finance?
Private equity and venture capital, absolutely.
What's the best industry somebody can get into in today's world?
Okay, I'm going to redefine the term industry. Africa. Look, here's the story. Follow me on this. 9 of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world are going to be in Africa in 2025. Everybody's overlooking it. Only 0.5% of the world's private equity and venture capital is going into Africa, despite the fact that it's going to be the only continent with a growing population. A marketplace is all about consumers and producers. Africa, as an industry, is the most overlooked investment opportunity for entrepreneurs and investors right now in 2025.
You know, a lot of people got a good chuckle out of Akon and that failure that he had. He, too, talked about using Bitcoin money to set up some sort of Akon city. It's the Wakanda dream. Well, keep in mind, white people were the ones who came up with Wakanda. It was a white man, Stan Lee, who invented it. And it was a white corporation, Disney, that made a movie about it. And you've had a bunch of too big grifters and professional BS artists who have been piggybacking off of that. Oh, you see that Black Panther movie? We can do that here. All you gotta do is give me money and I will build Wakanda. They've been riding on the back of that fraud. And now you got white people who are saying they are going to build Wakanda in Africa for the good of the Africans, of course, not for their own personal greed and their own personal benefit. They're doing it as an act of mass philanthropy, right? Well, even they're not pretending that this is charity. This is all about what's going to line their pockets. They will tell the same lie that the Romans and every other group of invaders and foreigners have said from day one. They're doing this all for your own benefit. Meanwhile, the only one who's getting anything out of it is them. If these good white folks wanted to do anything to develop Africa, they could have done it decades ago. But here they are after they broke the Africans' back. And now they're pretending as if they're going to repair the damage that they themselves did. They won't even admit to what they did. We know exactly how this game is going to turn out. All you got to do is look at Honduras. But whereas the Hondurans at least had enough sense to repeal the asinine law that they got tricked into passing, do you think the Africans are going to be able to do that? Or are they going to do what they've continued to do? Continue to play footsie with these white supremacists, get a pat on the head, and you'll have these very corporate raiders telling them, oh, you guys are so hardworking. You're not like those black Americans. You guys are better than that. Why, it's going to take so little to get you guys back on your feet again. Do you think that's what's going to happen? And then, inevitably, as is always the case, these false friends who pat them on the head and give them insincere praise will inevitably pull out a knife and slit the Africans' throats again. And then afterwards, charge them for the blade that they used to do it. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Antonio Daniels, Roxanne Allen, Suleiman Alaji, Scott Carson, and Richard Griffith. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.